On the morning of November 14, 1944, a light rain fell across the naval shipyard at Kure, Japan, where Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood beside a crater that had appeared overnight in the concrete yard. The shell, an enormous piece of American ordnance weighing nearly 1,200 kilograms, lay half buried at an angle, its olive-drab casing glistening with moisture. Around him, engineers and naval officers gathered at a respectful distance, their faces reflecting a mixture of professional curiosity and understandable caution. This was not the first unexploded American shell to land in the shipyard that month, but something about this one felt different. Yamamoto believed, as did every officer present, that American manufacturing was fundamentally inferior, rushed, sloppy, built by workers who cared nothing for precision or honor. The fact that so many shells failed to detonate seemed to confirm this belief. They assumed they would find another example of poor craftsmanship, perhaps faulty fusing or substandard explosives. They could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yamamoto and his team would discover inside that shell would shatter their assumptions about American industrial capability, trigger a crisis of confidence that would ripple through the highest levels of the Japanese military command, and ultimately contribute to the psychological collapse of an empire that had believed itself destined for victory. The story begins not in Japan, but 6,000 kilometers away in the industrial heartland of America, in a city called Bridgeport, Connecticut. There, in the sprawling facilities of the Remington Arms Company, a young woman named Dorothy Mitchell reported for her shift on a Tuesday morning in September of 1944. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a factory worker, and she had been building munitions for exactly 14 months. Before that, she had never held a tool more complicated than a kitchen knife. Now, she operated precision machinery that shaped the internal components of naval shells destined for the Pacific theater. Dorothy was one of nearly 19 million American women who entered the workforce during the conflict, transforming the United States into what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The scale of this transformation was almost incomprehensible. In 1940, American factories produced fewer than 300 aircraft per month. By 1944, they were producing nearly 8,000. The same explosive growth occurred in every category of military production: tanks, ships, trucks, ammunition, and shells. Millions upon millions of shells. The shell that would eventually land in Kure began its journey on a production line in Bridgeport, one of 47,000 similar shells produced that month alone. Each shell required over 200 individual components, assembled with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The work demanded focus, precision, and an almost meditative attention to detail. Dorothy had become expert at it. She could feel when a component was slightly off specification, a skill that had taken months to develop, but now seemed as natural as breathing. On that particular Tuesday, Dorothy was assigned to the final assembly line, where completed shells received their last inspections before being packed for shipment. Her supervisor, a former automobile engineer named Harold Peterson, walked the line with a clipboard checking each station. Peterson was known for his exacting standards. He had worked for General Motors before the conflict, designing transmissions for luxury sedans, and he brought that same precision mentality to munitions production. "Quality is not negotiable," Peterson would tell his workers. "Every shell that leaves this factory represents a promise to the men who will use it. We do not break promises." That philosophy permeated the entire American industrial system. Quality control was not merely a department, but a religion. Statistical sampling methods, pioneered by mathematicians at Bell Laboratories, allowed factories to maintain extraordinary consistency across millions of units. Every 100th shell was pulled from the line and subjected to exhaustive testing. Defect rates were tracked, analyzed, and reduced with scientific rigor. The result was a level of manufacturing precision that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. But the Americans did not stop at mere functionality. This is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. In early 1943, the United States Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the Central Intelligence Agency, approached several munitions manufacturers with an unusual request. They wanted to use artillery shells as a psychological weapon, not just a physical one. The idea was simple but profound. If Japanese forces could be made to understand the true scale and sophistication of American industrial power, it might undermine their will to continue resisting. The program was called Operation Manifest, and it remained classified for over 30 years after the conflict ended. The concept involved placing carefully selected items inside shells, not explosives, but messages. These items would be discovered when unexploded shells were recovered and disassembled for analysis, as routinely happened. The Japanese military studied every piece of American equipment they captured, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Operation Manifest would turn that practice against them. Dorothy Mitchell knew nothing about Operation Manifest. She simply followed the instructions she was given when certain shells came down her line, shells marked with a small blue dot on their base. These shells received a special internal package before final assembly, a sealed container that fit perfectly into a cavity designed for that purpose. She did not know what the containers held. She did not ask. She simply did her job with the same precision she brought to everything else. The shell that landed in Kure was one of these marked shells. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto ordered the unexploded ordnance moved to a secure analysis facility on the outskirts of the shipyard. This was standard procedure. The Japanese military maintained extensive programs to study captured enemy equipment, looking for technological advantages they might copy or vulnerabilities they might exploit. Yamamoto himself had supervised the analysis of over 40 American shells in the previous 6 months. He considered himself an expert on American manufacturing deficiencies. The extraction team, led by a munitions specialist named Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, worked through the night to safely remove the shell's fusing mechanism. This was delicate work. One mistake could trigger the nearly 300 kilograms of high explosive packed inside the casing. Tanaka had performed this procedure dozens of times, but he never allowed himself to become complacent. He worked slowly, methodically, his hands steady despite the obvious danger. By dawn on November 15th, the shell was rendered safe. The team began the careful process of disassembly, removing each component and cataloging it for analysis. They expected to find evidence of rushed production, misaligned parts, substandard materials, sloppy welds. Instead, they found something that stopped them cold. The first surprise was the quality of the machining. Every component fit together with watch-like precision. The threads were clean and uniform. The welds were flawless, with perfect penetration and no porosity. Tanaka, who had trained in metallurgy before his military career, recognized immediately that these were not the products of hasty mass production. They were works of industrial art. "This is impossible," he murmured, turning a brass fitting in his hands. This level of precision requires skilled craftsmen working slowly, carefully. You cannot achieve this at scale. But the Americans had achieved it at scale. That was the terrible truth that Tanaka was beginning to glimpse. The second surprise came when they opened the shell's main cavity. Inside, nestled among the explosive charges, they found a sealed metal container about the size of a coffee can. It was not part of the shell's functional design. It was clearly an addition, deliberately placed. Tanaka called for Yamamoto. When the lieutenant commander arrived, he stared at the container for a long moment before speaking. "Open it," he said quietly. Inside the container, wrapped in waxed paper to protect against moisture, they found several items that would haunt Yamamoto for the rest of his life. The first item was a photograph. It showed a group of women standing in front of an American factory, smiling at the camera. They wore work clothes and safety goggles pushed up on their foreheads. Some held tools, others held components that were recognizably parts of artillery shells. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in neat English, "Bridgeport Shell Assembly Team 7, September 1944. This shell made with pride by the women of Connecticut." Yamamoto spoke English. He translated the inscription for Tanaka, who shook his head in disbelief. "Women," he said. "They are using women to build their weapons." The second item was a small booklet, printed on high-quality paper with color illustrations. It was a product catalog, from an American department store called Sears, Roebuck and Company. The catalog showed page after page of consumer goods available for purchase: refrigerators, automobiles, clothing, furniture, toys. The prices were printed next to each item. The variety was overwhelming. The implication was clear, and it was devastating. America was not only outproducing Japan in weapons of conflict, it was simultaneously producing consumer goods in quantities that Japan could not match even in peacetime. The American economy was so vast, so powerful, that it could wage total war across 2 oceans while still manufacturing iceboxes and washing machines for its citizens at home. The third item was the most impactful of all. It was a single sheet of paper, typed in both English and Japanese. The Japanese translation was slightly imperfect, clearly produced by someone who had learned the language academically rather than natively, but it was entirely understandable. The message read, "To the Japanese technician who opens this shell, we know you are a person of skill and intelligence. We respect your expertise. We want you to understand something important. This shell is one of 47,000 produced this month at a single American factory. There are 93 such factories currently operating in the United States. We produce more shells in 1 week than Japan produces in 1 year. This is not a boast. It is a fact. We do not wish to continue this conflict. We wish for peace, but we are prepared to continue as long as necessary. We have the resources. We have the workers. We have the will. Consider carefully what this means for the future. The choice is yours." Yamamoto read the message 3 times. Then he sat down heavily on a nearby crate and did not speak for several minutes. Lieutenant Tanaka watched his superior officer with growing concern. "Sir," he finally said, "what should we do with this?" Yamamoto looked up. His face had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. "Report it," he said. "Report it to Tokyo. They need to know." The report that Yamamoto sent to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo triggered exactly the crisis of confidence that Operation Manifest had intended. The discovery at Kure was not an isolated incident. Similar packages had been found in other unexploded shells across the Pacific Theater, in the Philippines, in Okinawa, in Burma. Each contained slightly different items, but the message was always the same. America's industrial capacity was limitless, and Japan's defeat was merely a matter of time. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese military culture placed enormous emphasis on fighting spirit, on the belief that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantages. This belief had sustained the military through years of increasingly difficult conditions. But the shells told a different story. They suggested that fighting spirit was irrelevant when the enemy could simply bury you in machinery and metal. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the Combined Fleet, received a briefing on the Kure discovery on November 20th, 1944. According to officers who were present, he listened in silence, then asked a single question: "Are these figures accurate?" The briefing officer confirmed that Japanese intelligence had independently verified the American production numbers. They were, if anything, conservative. Toyoda nodded slowly. "Then we must reconsider our strategy," he said. This was a remarkable statement from a man who had just months earlier advocated for increasingly aggressive offensive operations. The shells were changing minds at the highest levels of Japanese command. But the story does not end there. To understand its full impact, we must return to Bridgeport, to the factory where the shell was made, and to the young woman who helped build it. Dorothy Mitchell did not know that her work was having any effect at all. She simply reported for her shift each day, operated her machines, and went home to the small apartment she shared with her mother and younger sister. Her father had passed away in 1941, just before America entered the conflict, and Dorothy had become the family's primary breadwinner. The wages at Remington were good, better than anything she could have earned before the conflict, and she took pride in her work. But she did not think of herself as participating in psychological warfare. She thought of herself as doing a job. The women of Bridgeport came from every background imaginable. Some, like Dorothy, were from working-class families with long histories in manufacturing. Others were college-educated, former teachers or nurses or office workers who had never set foot in a factory before. Some were young, barely 18. Others were grandmothers who had raised families and buried husbands. What united them was a shared sense of purpose, a belief that their work mattered. That belief was not misplaced. The shells they built, the planes and tanks and ships that poured out of American factories, were drowning the opposition in a tide of steel. By late 1944, the United States was producing more weapons than the rest of the world combined. This was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate planning, massive investment, and the mobilization of an entire society. The women were central to this effort. With millions of men serving overseas, the factories depended on female workers to maintain production. These women learned skills that had previously been considered exclusively male domains. They operated lathes and drill presses and welding equipment. They read blueprints and calculated tolerances and solved problems on the fly. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, for years on end, and they did it well. That was the secret that the Japanese military was only beginning to understand. American women were not inferior substitutes for male workers. They were skilled professionals who took pride in their craft and produced work of extraordinary quality. The shells that landed in Kure were not flukes. They were representative of American manufacturing as a whole, precise, reliable, and produced in quantities that defied comprehension. Harold Peterson, the supervisor at Bridgeport, understood this better than most. He had initially been skeptical when the first women arrived at his factory in early 1942. He had assumed they would require constant supervision and produce substandard work. He had been completely wrong. "They are the best workers I have ever had," he told a journalist who visited the factory in 1944. "They pay attention. They follow procedures. They care about quality. I would take a factory full of women over a factory full of men any day." This was not empty praise. Quality metrics at American factories showed that women consistently matched or exceeded the performance of male workers on precision tasks. The shells they produced had lower defect rates and higher reliability. The psychological warfare program worked because the quality of the shells was genuinely exceptional. The messages inside were only the final touch on products that already told their own story. Back in Japan, the ripple effects of the Kure discovery continued to spread. Junior officers who learned about the American production figures began to question whether victory was still possible. Some of these officers had already harbored private doubts. The shells gave those doubts concrete form. Others had been true believers who now faced a crisis of faith. Lieutenant Tanaka was one of the latter. He had been a dedicated officer, committed to the cause, certain that Japanese spirit would ultimately triumph over American materialism. The shell changed everything. He wrote in his diary on November 22nd, "We have been told that the Americans are soft, that they lack the will to sacrifice. But this shell tells a different story. It was made by women who work in factories while their men fight overseas, women who produce weapons of this quality by the tens of thousands. These are not soft people. These are serious people. And there are so many of them." Tanaka's disillusionment was not unique. Across the Japanese military, morale was beginning to crack under the weight of material reality. The shells were only one factor among many, but they were a particularly effective one because they delivered their message so directly. You did not need to be told about American production capacity. You could hold the evidence in your hands. Admiral Toyoda convened a meeting of senior naval officers on December 1, 1944, to discuss strategic options. The meeting was contentious. Some officers argued for continued offensive operations, insisting that one decisive victory could still turn the tide. Others advocated for a defensive strategy designed to make further American advances so costly that they would negotiate a settlement. A few, speaking carefully and indirectly, suggested that Japan should seek peace while it still had some leverage. The shells came up repeatedly during the discussion. One admiral described them as the most demoralizing intelligence we have received in months. Another called them a form of psychological attack more effective than any bombing raid. There was no consensus on what to do about them, but there was general agreement that they represented a serious problem. In the end, the strategic picture was too bleak for any single factor to be decisive. American forces were advancing on multiple fronts. Japanese losses in ships, aircraft, and trained personnel were unsustainable. The home islands were being systematically blockaded and bombed. The shells were simply one more weight on a scale that was already tipping toward defeat. But they mattered. They mattered because they reached people who would never see a battlefield, people who made decisions in conference rooms far from the front lines. They mattered because they spoke a language that military professionals understood, the language of precision, quality, and scale. They mattered because they were true. The woman who made the shell did not know any of this. Dorothy Mitchell continued working at the Bridgeport factory until August of 1945, when the conflict ended and production was scaled back. She received a certificate of appreciation from the War Department and a small bonus. Then she went home and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. The transition was not easy. Millions of women faced the same challenge. They had developed skills and found purpose in the factories, but now the factories wanted their jobs back for the returning men. Dorothy was fortunate. Peterson, her supervisor, recommended her for a position at a small manufacturing firm in Hartford that made precision components for aircraft. She worked there for 37 years, eventually becoming a quality control supervisor herself. She never knew about Operation Manifest. The program remained classified until 1978, when it was finally declassified as part of a broader release of wartime intelligence documents. A historian named Robert Chen stumbled across references to it while researching a book on psychological warfare, and spent 3 years tracking down surviving participants and documents. Chen eventually identified Dorothy Mitchell as one of the workers who had assembled the marked shells. He interviewed her in 1981 when she was 60 years old and long retired. She was stunned to learn that her work had been part of a deliberate psychological warfare campaign. "We were told those packages were calibration equipment," she said. "Some kind of testing device to measure the shell's performance. Nobody said anything about messages. Nobody said anything about Japan." Chen showed her a translation of the message that had been found in the Kure shell. Dorothy read it slowly, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "We really wrote that?" she asked. "We really told them about ourselves?" "You did," Chen said, "and it worked." Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto survived the conflict. He was in Tokyo when it ended, having been transferred from Kure to a staff position at Naval Headquarters. After Japan's surrender, he spent 2 years in detention while American occupation authorities reviewed his wartime record. He was eventually cleared and released, having committed no crimes. Yamamoto never forgot the shell. He spoke about it in interviews with historians, including Chen, and he wrote about it in a memoir published in 1967. He described the moment of opening the container as the moment I knew we would lose. "It was not the message," he explained. "It was everything else. The photograph of the women, the catalogue full of goods, the quality of the shell itself. Everything told the same story. America was not just strong. America was overwhelming. We had been trained to believe that spirit could overcome material. But there is a limit. There is always a limit." Yamamoto and Dorothy never met, though they lived just a few hundred kilometers apart, he in Tokyo, she in Connecticut, for decades after the conflict. They were connected by a single shell, a single moment in history, a single message that traveled across the Pacific and changed at least one man's understanding of the world. The story of Operation Manifest reveals something important about the nature of the conflict and about the nature of industrial production itself. The program worked not because of propaganda or deception, but because of truth. The Americans did not lie about their production capacity. They did not exaggerate the quality of their manufacturing. They simply showed the evidence and let it speak for itself. The shells were their own argument. This was, in a sense, a new kind of warfare. Previous conflicts had been decided by courage, tactics, and numbers of soldiers. The second global conflict was decided, ultimately, by factories. The side that could produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, more shells would inevitably prevail. Japan understood this intellectually but could not quite believe it emotionally. The shells made it real. The women of Bridgeport were not soldiers. They did not carry weapons or face enemy fire, but they were warriors nonetheless. Warriors in a war of production, a war of precision, a war of overwhelming industrial might. Their victory was measured not in territory captured, but in shells shipped, in quality metrics achieved, in the slow erosion of enemy confidence. Dorothy Mitchell lived until 2004, passing away at the age of 83. Her obituary mentioned her long career in manufacturing, but said nothing about Operation Manifest. By then, the program had been largely forgotten, a footnote in the vast history of the conflict, but it should be remembered. It should be remembered because it shows what ordinary people can accomplish when they are organized and motivated and supplied with the right tools. It should be remembered because it shows the power of truth, delivered at the right moment, to change minds. And it should be remembered because it honors the millions of women who left their homes, entered the factories, and helped build the weapons that ended the most destructive conflict in human history. The shell that landed in Kure on November 14, 1944, was one of millions. It was not special in any technical sense. It was built by ordinary women doing ordinary work, according to ordinary procedures. But it carried a message that was anything but ordinary. It carried the truth about American power, American resolve, and American capability. And that truth, dropped into the heart of the enemy's military-industrial complex, did more damage than any explosion ever could. Lieutenant Tanaka also survived the conflict. He returned to his hometown in northern Japan and became a schoolteacher, spending 40 years educating young people about mathematics and science. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but he kept his diary, and his family donated it to a historical archive after his passing in 1992. The entry for November 15, 1944, the day after the shell arrived, contains a single sentence that captures the essence of what Operation Manifest achieved. Today, I saw the future, and we are not in it. He was wrong, of course. Japan had a future. It rebuilt itself into one of the world's great economic powers, a peaceful and prosperous nation that transformed its industrial capability from instruments of conflict into instruments of commerce. Toyota and Sony and Honda became household names around the world. The same energy and skill that had built the Japanese military machine built something better. But Tanaka was right about the immediate future. Japan could not win a conflict of production against the United States. No one could. The arsenal of democracy was simply too vast, too efficient, too relentless. The shells that came off the lines at Bridgeport and dozens of other factories were physical proof of that reality. And inside some of those shells, carefully placed by women who did not fully understand what they were doing, were messages that delivered that proof directly into the hands of those who most needed to receive it. That is the story of the shell that landed in Kure, a story of production and precision, of women and weapons, of messages sent across an ocean and received in the heart of an empire. It is a story about the power of industry and the power of truth. And it is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, even when they did not know they were doing them. Dorothy Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, Lieutenant Tanaka, none of them set out to make history. They were simply doing their jobs, following their orders, trying to survive a conflict that had engulfed the world. But history found them anyway. It found them in a shell, in a message, in a photograph of smiling women standing in front of an American factory. We remember the generals and admirals who commanded great fleets and armies. We remember the presidents and prime ministers who made the grand strategic decisions. But we should also remember the workers on the assembly lines, the technicians in the analysis labs, the ordinary men and women who built and studied the weapons that decided the fate of nations. They were the ones who made the shells. They were the ones who opened them. And they were the ones who learned the truth. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.